Very good, thank you. I'm very pleased to be your guest here. This is quite a complex place. I appreciated the previous presentation very much because it had a lot of data, and it shows very clearly the high levels of growth that are driving the internet here. I'm going to go down a couple of levels. I apologize that I can't speak Russian today. My Russian is kind of like a kindergarten student, so thank you to the translators as well. So, my name is Jim Cowie. I'm from Renesys, and we make a job of studying the entire internet, all of the regions of the world, and measuring it to understand how it can work for businesses. And the Russian marketplace is one of my favorites because it is a very great challenge to understand. There are markets on Earth that are large, and there are markets on Earth that change and are quite interesting. This is probably the largest and most interesting market on Earth, I think. Today we're going to take a quick look at just 4 of the wholesale providers in Russia. And because Russia is such a complex place, this is perhaps a suspicious strategy. If you think of the Russian ecosystem as tens of thousands of autonomous systems, then it's like a jungle. It's like a whole planet full of life. And here we're just going to look at the tiger and the lion and the elephant, and that's it. But sometimes you can tell a lot from the health of the big animals in the jungle about what might be happening underneath. So today we'll take a look at what Renesys identifies as the top 4 wholesale providers. So when we say wholesale, we mean autonomous systems who provide global internet transit to other autonomous systems who provide transit to other autonomous systems, okay? So not access networks, not hosting, not content, but the people upstream. And there are 4 very large ones here: Rostelecom, Megaphone, Transtelecom, and VimpelCom Beeline. So as context, what we do is we measure the internet 2 different ways. We use BGP peering with over 400 providers everywhere in the world, including many here in Russia, in both IPv4 and IPv6. So if you're interested, please come and see me. We always like to peer with more people in every market. We also have our own global measurement infrastructure for traceroute, measuring the latencies to about 1.5 million individual IP addresses around the planet from over 100 sources worldwide. So it turns out to be about 3 billion measurements a day of point-to-point latency. It's a little bit like the excellent Right Atlas project. I guess it's complementary in many ways. We curate our set of responding hosts very carefully, and we try to incorporate the observations that we make so that they're available every day. So today we're just going to take a look at the logical structure of the Russian internet from the perspective of these 4 providers. The other thing we're going to do besides old BGP, which many of you have seen me talk about many times, we'll also look at how people choose to rename their autonomous systems in the registries, which is an interesting signal about how people think about mergers and acquisitions. Do you allow a subsidiary to continue with its own name, or do you rename it and move it on net? So different things going on. So here's the wholesale ranking that Renesys came up with in this last month. And again, this is only wholesale, looking at these autonomous systems who sell to autonomous systems who sell to autonomous systems. So from the top, Rostelecom, Megaphone, Transtelecom, VimpelCom. There are more here on the list that we won't talk about today. It doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that, as you can see on the right, they get smaller and smaller relative to Rostelecom. After VimpelCom, at 5 and 6, you see some international providers who are selling directly to Russian providers, wholesale. Telia, level 3. Then comes important backbone, Retin. And then ER Telecom. And then we start to see subsidiaries of some of the top people, other ASs that are very large in their own right, but then they may feed up through their parent to get international transit. and domestic transit. So Rostelecom again, 35400. Then Cable and Wireless, Rascom, very important here in St. Petersburg and linking on to Finland. MTS, the other member of the Troika, mobile providers. Telecom Italia, more Rostelecom, Tata, and finally Cogent. And the list goes on. It goes on quite a long way. This is just one slide. So let us start with Rostelecom. Number one. This is their new logo, which I really like. They have about almost 500 autonomous systems as customers, as downstreams at this point. It's quite large. They have about 7,400 IPv4 networks, either originated or transited. They are number 2 in retail only because one of their subsidiaries, actually one of the subsidiary ASs actually carries more retail traffic than 12389 does today. There's a little bit of IPv6 going on. You can see 23 ASs now downstream of Rostelecom getting IPv6 transit, which is small but hopeful, and about 185 networks coming through. So, of course, as you all know, but I have to explain it to people outside of Russia, the big story here for several years has been the reassembly of Rostelecom, putting it back together. So I found a copy of the instruction manual for building Rostelecom. It takes 2 screwdrivers and a hammer and all of Russia. There's 83 different autonomous systems now under Rostelecom, almost all of which have now been renamed Rostelecom, as we shall see. So this is originally the regional providers were left to go their own way, owned by Svyazhinvest. Now those have been brought back together. The ownership is impossible to understand by anybody outside Russia. Rostelecom, Svyazhinvest, they own each other at the same time. But ultimately, I suppose by next month, there will be the special meeting of Rostelecom shareholders, and Svyazhinvest will come under the umbrella, and everything will be back together. Oh. So what's interesting, I guess, about Rostelecom is that it retains a lot of this regional structure, that the autonomous systems that are transiting through 12389 retain a lot of their local flavor. They haven't really been integrated into 12389. So you still see the big ones like 44237 and 25515, right? Old Central Telecom, and 41440, which is Sibir Telecom. And in the Far East, 12332 and the other one that are old Far East Telecom. Well, now they're all Rostelecom, but the routing footprint remains the same. If we go back and look at the dates when all of this took place, I think the official action took place in April 2011. And shortly thereafter, we started to see the registrations turning over. It started very slowly with just a couple, Northwest Telecom, some of Volga Telecom. In August 2011 was when we really saw all of the re-registrations take place. So this is quite a few. I think they're in numeric order here, so you can find your AS. These are all of the little regional providers, all of the small regional players, brought back and changed to Rostelecom. And this isn't all of them. It just continues, right? So in 2011, in August, all the way through to the end here. And then cleaning up small bits and pieces have continued all the way through this year. I think there are already almost 10 this year. And increasingly, they are still some of the remaining unconverted regional providers, but also some of the consulting companies, some of the information services companies, some of the other pieces of the puzzle that are still coming together under the umbrella of Rostelecom. So moving on to number 2, here's Megaphone, which grew very rapidly through the last few years through some acquisitions strategically. Number 2 in wholesale behind Rostelecom, and according to our measurements of IP prefix space routed, they have about a little more than half of the sort of on-net presence in Russia that Rostelecom does. So fewer AS customers, about the same number, I suppose, of transited IPv4 networks. Again, they're doing a little bit of IPv6, which is great. About 22 ASs, about 31 networks, a little more than one network per customer. And they did the same thing. So Megaphone was interesting because as they acquired Synterra, they made the strategic decision to begin folding their operations together. They picked an autonomous system and they moved operations together and actually moved customers into the Megaphone AS. So these are the things that they have rolled up and renamed Megaphone since that started, which started before 2011. So old Mobicom space, old Synterra space, the acquisition of Peterstar here in St. Petersburg. All of these things were folded together, and then it kind of ends. They reach the end of what they can acquire in late 2012, and there haven't been any additional changes since. And if you look at the map of Russia, you see that they have similar ASs in similar places serving similar markets. Mostly the old Synterra backbone still alive, being transited up through Megaphone, and Peterstar here, and even some in the Far East, some of the leftover, the Mobicom resources from Khabarovsk, all under the Megaphone umbrella. If we look at number 3, Trans Telecom, you see some interesting differences here. So again, they're about the same size relative to Rustelecom, a little smaller than Megaphone, so 49% of Rustelecom. They've got about 440 AS customers, over 10,000 IPv4 networks. Well, why are they number 3? We'll take a look in a second. Again, they're doing a little bit of IPv6. Everybody seems to do the same kind of amount of IPv6. If you take a look here, this explains why Trans Telecom has over 10,000 networks advertised up through them, and yet they're number 3. Look at the CIDR block distribution, okay? So this is the aggregation of the on-net set of prefixes. And it may be a little bit hard to read in the back, but the colors are red for Rustelecom, and you can see them over the top. Blue for Trans Telecom. Trans Telecom has very few large blocks. I think they have only maybe 2/14s in the table. And that grows as you go. Vimpelcom in purple, Megaphone in green. So it's interesting that if you compare the /14s to the /24s, the rankings turn upside down. Megaphone does the best job of aggregation, keeping a compact routing table with a relatively large number of very large prefixes. Note that this is logarithmic scale, I suppose on both axes, since these are CIDR blocks. So as it goes up and to the right, you see that by the time we get to /24, highly deaggregated, it's just the opposite. Megaphone has the fewest /24s of the 4, and Trans Telecom has a very large number of 22s to 24s, which is why they have 10,000 networks and yet have a slightly lower ranking overall. So pretty interesting there. You can also see that Rustelecom in red, coming over the top of the curve at the larger prefix sizes, still has a large set of legacy, I would guess legacy blocks, larger customers, probably older customers, who are sitting on address space in the 14 to 18 range. Very sizable blocks, which may become interesting once we get deeper into IPv4 exhaustion mode. So the last stop on our tour is Vimpelcom, Beeline, Golden Telecom. The 4th ranked provider, also 4th ranked in our retail ranking of direct access. Over 500 ASs, almost 7,000 IPv4 networks, a little bit of IPv6. Look at their growth. We have a little bit of negative growth going on in our rankings in the last few months. And perhaps we can take a look. Let's step back and look at these 4 providers over the last 2.5 years. So this chart shows something very interesting. Starting on January 1st, 2010, we see the percentage of Russia on net. This is not a measurement of traffic, this is only our model, but this is our estimate of the percentage of the global market on net with each one of these 4 providers. And they add up to more than 100% because almost everybody is multi-homed. But if you look at their customer cones, you see a few things. Even though the Russian internet is growing overall, the volumes are growing, the complexity is growing, everything is growing, the relative proportions of on-net are about constant. So Rostelecom has 40 to 45% of the country on net. They've caught up that far by reassembling and getting everything under 12.389. And it's pretty much steady. That's in red. You can see in blue, Trans Telecom is holding about 30 to 35%, maybe a slight decline over the last 2.5 years, but basically pretty steady. You can see Megafon in green. Megafon's share starts off in 2010 nowhere. They would never have been in this talk if I gave this talk in 2010. They had 2–3% of the national market. And then over time, as they acquired Syntera, and they integrated it into their backbone, and they acquired Peterstar and did the same, they grew in importance until they reached about 20 to 25%. And then something interesting happens. You'll notice that in purple, we have Vimpelcom. What happened to Vimpelcom? They didn't really lose any customers, but what happened was that as Megafon grew larger, initially the relationship between Megafon and Vimpelcom was something that looked a lot like internet transit, paid transit, a simple provider-customer relationship. Around the time of June 2012, Megafon apparently starts to generate enough traffic that they can renegotiate. And very rapidly, within the space of about 2 weeks, we see the routing change, and we see that Vimpelcom no longer passes Megafon routes to people that are transit providers of theirs. We no longer see other peering edges next to this one, right? Which would tell us that it was still transit. So we think there's a machine learning algorithm that goes on 24 hours a day at Renesys trying to figure things like this out. And at the end of June, our algorithm said, you know what, I think this just became peering. And so we reclassified Megafon as a customer, from a customer to a peer. And Vimpelcom's on-net score dropped accordingly. And so their true score today, probably around 20%. So otherwise, though, it's an extremely stable relative proportion. Let's look for a minute at the local geography. So one of the interesting things in our tools in the last year or so is that we've started offering metro-level analyses of the internet. We only do this for interesting countries, so Brazil, Turkey, China, and Russia. Oh, and India. So in Russia, we look at the large cities here. Green means that you have a large percentage of the city as your customer, indirectly. Red means you have a very small percentage of the city as your customer. So go right down the left-hand side, and you can see that Rostelecom is doing really well. They have over 50% in most of these cities. They have 94% of Vladivostok on net. They have less on net in places where it's very competitive, like Moscow, like Kazan. They have less on net in cities where people tend to get international connectivity directly, like Rostov or St. Petersburg. TTK has a similar picture, except a little bit less. It's the only way I can characterize it. They have roughly the same footprint, it appears, as Rostelecom in all of these cities, and yet they have a little bit less. They do better in certain places like Novosibirsk, but really it's pretty close. Megafon has a more uneven profile. They have fewer cities where they do well, but there are cities like Omsk and Novosibirsk where they do at least as well as Rostelecom. In other cities, they have a smaller percentage of the country on net, and the same is really true for Vimpelcom. If you look across and you say which ones of these cities are the ones that have the most or the least provider dominance from the top 4, well, as I said, you can clearly see that Vladivostok always jumps out when you do these kinds of analyses. The former closed city has a very strong footprint for Rostelecom and really not much else for the others. Again, you see Rostov, Kazan, Moscow with very low levels of on-net percentage for any particular one of these 4 providers. So kind of interesting. Since we have a few minutes, we'll take a look at what goes on overseas as well. So far we've talked about only the domestic market, only the percentage of the Russian market and the city markets that are participating with these 4 providers. So we do our best job with geolocation. It is very difficult to really tell where an IP address is physically, but we do our best. And so we compute some of the analyses of international footprint. So this chart is for Rostelecom, and it shows you roughly how many prefixes, network prefixes, they are routing, not directly but indirectly as well, for various countries. Russia is the big blue. After that, their largest footprint is in Iran and Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. Iran, interesting because of their indirect relationship with DCI, the incumbent in Iran, with transit going down through Azerbaijan, and smaller amounts elsewhere in Central Asia down into Iraq. If you just take a look at Iran, if you've ever been curious, does Russia really serve Iran? Yeah, here are all the cities in Iran where there's at least one internet service provider, at least one network that owes a really large piece of its international connectivity to Rostelecom. And basically it's the entire country because of that key relationship. We can do the same thing for Transtelecom, and it looks pretty similar with some key differences. Transtelecom has dedicated ASs in other countries, which may or may not flow up through the main AS, so they may be bigger internationally than we depict them. But Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and on down the list. There's some China in there, but don't panic. I think those are misgeolocated Chinese networks that are actually located in Moscow. Owned by China, physically present in Moscow. This gives you an idea of why this is difficult to do geographically. I don't know if you can read at the bottom. At the bottom, you can actually see the map of how Russia provides transit to the Kurds in northern Iraq. You can see it's through multiple vendors, through 3 international providers into Rostelecom, through 2 other international providers to Transtelecom, both of them providing transit to Delta Telecom in Baku, Delta providing downstream to the local providers in Iraq. So kind of neat. It's not just one provider, it's really multiple Russian providers helping to keep this region online. And for Kurdistan, at this point in their development after the war, that's actually really important. So I don't think a lot of people appreciate the role that Russian providers play in keeping them online. Here's the same picture for Megaphone. Megaphone's picture is a little bit more Russian, but they also do have some key international constituencies. Kazakhstan, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, into Afghanistan, which is kind of neat. At the bottom, again, you see one of these pictures that shows how all the Russian providers help Afghanistan stay connected, and it's many different ways. You can see Rostelecom and Transtelecom and Megaphone all lined up to be providers, and Vimpelcom, being terrestrial providers to Intal JV, which is in Uzbekistan. And the Uzbeks come down from the north and provide transit to the Afghan government, who then provides transit to subsidiaries and companies in Afghanistan, which is kind of neat. There's another path. So Vimpelcom helps Afghanistan twice, once terrestrially, and then again through its provider relationship with Teo, LT, which is a major satellite provider that's selling to Satgate, and Satgate is providing service to Afghanistan. So again, it's an important mesh of support for a country that really needs all the help it can get. Vimpelcom tends to be, Vimpelcom Beeline's international picture tends to be more Russian. Some small relationships, almost entirely due, I think, to the service through Teo. I think that's probably where we're going to leave it, only because I don't want to take all the time before lunch. There's things we could talk about here for days, maybe weeks. Many of the things that I've described, I barely understand. And so I would love to have feedback from you to help fill in the missing picture here. What did I not understand? What did I say wrong? We don't know what happens next in the Russian wholesale market. The presentation before mine showed that there is going to be a lot of traffic and a lot of demand, and a lot of that is going to be mobile-based, and a lot of that is going to be LTE-based. It's not, I guess from that point it becomes a question of regulation and licensing and who's going to be a serious LTE provider, and I don't have data yet. I didn't talk really about transit to Hong Kong or to China in general or through Central Asia. We know that those routes exist, and we know that these providers are offering them at some price, but frankly, we don't see them used very much. There have been times over the years where we saw evidence appear and then disappear. So we can't talk about what we can't see. There are other projects that Russia participates in, like the EPEG cable system. This is the Europe-Persia Express Gateway, which starts, it's a beautiful, great circle route that starts in Oman and goes under the Strait of Hormuz, and goes across Iran on 2 protected paths, and then across Azerbaijan. It meets Rostelecom at the border. Rostelecom takes it to Cable and Wireless, who takes it to Frankfurt. And that has been a very successful path that's only emerged in the last month or so. I didn't mention it here because, frankly, Russian providers don't really appear visibly. It's more of a layer 2 offering. It looks to the rest of the world as if Omantel were magically selling to Cable and Wireless in Frankfurt. A lot of things that we can still see, a lot of things left to learn. I hope that this has been useful in at least starting the conversation. And again, I would love to have your feedback as we go through the meeting here today. So thank you very much. Oh, and next time we're going to talk more about IPv6. As you can see, the IPv6 participation of these providers is not top ranked. People like Reton and Cogent and Hurricane Electric are doing a lot more with it. But that's another day. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's amazing how much one can discover just looking at BGP and trace routes.
It is.
And studying the internet. I think у нас есть время на несколько вопросов.
Now we have time for a couple of questions. So if you have any questions to Jim, please, you're welcome with them.
Okay.
So there was a lot of interesting numbers, and well, you said it's kind of amazing, but what's the main takeaway? What's the substantive difference of this market compared, let's say, to the United States?
This market is, let me perhaps put it in context. We've done a lot of study in other contexts over the last year about the role of diversity in international transit markets and having as many individual independent providers as possible. We believe that that creates a lot of robustness for the internet and also for the economy, because it prevents substantial countrywide problems from emerging if you have more and more providers. Russia has similar internal diversity to the United States. It has a huge number of providers working very, very aggressively to interconnect. The trend towards reassembly of Rostelecom is, I think, the key interesting thing for us, to see where that process goes and to see how it affects competition in the country. Not to look at it politically or from a regulatory policy standpoint, because that's not what we do, but just observing how this may evolve from the data perspective.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you, Jim.